Welcome to Ars Aequi, the podcast on all things law and technology. I'm Tima.
I'm Paul, and on this episode, Your Honor, I'm a cat.
So welcome to another episode of the Ars Equi podcast. It's been a while, hey?
Yeah, it's great to be back, though.
It feels so good to be back. I missed chatting to you, Paul. I missed chatting to the people.
Right.
I just missed the whole vibe. So I'm really excited to be back.
Yeah. I hope you had a great time with our colleagues from the department with the Pass the Mic series, where our colleagues presented their research projects at the department. And now we're back with a brand new series. We're calling it Digital Justice, and we want to explain the digital aspects of access to justice and how technology can make it easier for you to get your rights enforced.
Right. So, I mean, the title might sound a little strange, Your Honor, I'm a cat, but it's in reference to the super hilarious clip that went viral a couple months ago. And it's basically this lawyer in Zoom court, and he has a cat filter on his face. And he keeps saying, "No, Your Honor, it's me.
I'm not a cat.
Whatever. I'm not a cat."
And then the assistant comes and tries to get it off.
Tries to get the filter off on the Zoom call, and it's a whole thing, but it's so funny. And there's so many funny clips that have come from Zoom courts and these virtual hearings that have been taking place. So we thought it would be super interesting to dive into this, talk about the legal aspects, pros and cons, and what does this look like for us in the future when we want to have access to the court?
Yeah, because this wasn't really common before COVID, that you have a video conference where you have also legal proceedings. This has been done in certain cases, and we have some examples for this. But mostly it was just people sitting in a room and talking.
Exactly. So, I mean, one case that I definitely heard of in law school was cases that dealt with children, especially children who were victims of sexual abuse or physical abuse. And oftentimes the court would use video conferencing mechanisms because they didn't want the child to appear in court under the stress and in front of all these people. So the child would be in another room in the courthouse with a psychiatrist or a social worker, and then they would kind of be a video conference, and there would be a TV or a screen in the courtroom, and the judge would ask the child questions from a distance or communicate with the child from a distance. And this was done because it was, in the best interest of the child to keep them outside of the courtroom.
Right, and these advantages also stretch to other areas, which we will talk about. But mostly, so before COVID, if there was a witness that was in another country, for example, this was a huge deal for them either having to travel or, which was the Austrian solution, if inside Austria you had to kind of get a witness statement that was living somewhere else at the other end of the country, they could actually come to a court in their region and then testify before a judge there, and then it will just be a protocol, which won't even be word for word, but just a summary of what they said.
Exactly.
And this would then be sent to the other judge.
Right, and it also placed difficulties on courts having to book rooms, right? So there's only so many courtrooms, and there are hundreds and thousands of cases. So lots of cases sat on the docket for months, sometimes even years, because booking a courtroom, finding times when judges were free to hear certain cases or whatever, was so problematic.
So much logistics.
Exactly. So the backlog is something that Zoom Court has really dealt with. So anyways, we're going to talk a little bit about access to justice, right? And whether or not, or what the pros and cons are with Zoom Court or virtual hearings in relation to this.
Right. So we decided to take a look at the definition for the right to a fair trial, which is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and is also in a couple of other legal documents outlining human rights.
Yes. So the right to a fair trial is essentially something that you'll find in almost every democratic constitution. And it has a lot of different elements of what constitutes a fair trial, right? So a trial has to be fair, of course. It should be open, and it should be a public hearing, meaning that it shouldn't be done behind closed doors, all hush hush. It should be done out in the open where people can have access to that information.
And Zoom Court, at least in some parts, changes this. So on the one hand, for considering, for example, the right to public trial, this is quite different, because normally you can the times when court when hearings are held is posted publicly somewhere, and you can just go into the room and just sit there and watch this, even without any justification whatsoever. But with Zoom, it's on one hand, harder to do this because you need to know the access data, or you need to get someone to let you in, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's much easier to be recorded and then shared.
Right. So a lot of courts, especially in the US, have been circumventing this or making sure that they give effect to this public hearing right by live streaming on YouTube, right? Which sounds crazy.
I mean, it's very American, honestly.
It's very American because like nowhere else.
Yeah, I mean, they're like streaming it live on TV, then they can also stream it live on YouTube. Like the difference isn't there.
So now you can go on YouTube and you have access to. I did it while I was researching for this. I just kind of went down a rabbit hole on YouTube and had access to like crazy cases and all these interesting different things that you can see. But that's kind of how Zoom doesn't necessarily have to circumvent this right to having the case be heard by the public.
Right. So maybe let's break this down a bit, like why there is a right to a public trial. So on the one hand, there is you really, as an individual, can go there and can see how justice is done. So you can convince yourself that this is right and this is fair, right?
True. And also in many cases, at least the conception of a crime was that crimes were committed against communities. So even though there was one individual or a group of individuals that were directly affected, the notion is that a crime affects the entire community. So the idea was that hearings should be public so that the community can be involved in the bringing about of justice. And the idea was that the community would be able to heal and see justice be done in front of their eyes and be able to move on from the crime. I think that's kind of like the archaic notion around having a public trial.
Now, if this is publicized and kind of becomes a spectacle, how it sometimes become, and especially in high-profile cases. So, for example, what we're having now going on in Austria, but also other cases where it's like really vicious crimes that are like attract a lot of public attention. This can also be a downside, right?
Right, and I think also one thing about publicizing it on YouTube is that it takes it beyond the community. It even takes it beyond the country where the crime takes place. Like I'm here in Austria watching YouTube videos about cases that happen like in Tennessee. You know what I mean? Like that has nothing to do with me. I'm not the affected community. But now we all have access to this information. We all have access to watching these cases. And does that affect the victims in a negative way? Does it affect the defendants in a negative way? And does it trivialize the whole legal process when court cases become memes?
Right. I mean, like even without publicizing the whole proceedings on YouTube, even then accused are stigmatized, and there's a whole media what is the word?
Like a media frenzy?
Media frenzy is the word, right? Right, media frenzy.
Like OJ style, media frenzy.
Exactly. Like this is what I'm thinking of. And like media going crazy, and this even if they're acquitted, then still the stigma remains.
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely what we can put on the con side of this type of virtual hearing is that one, it lives online forever. So once, if you're a defendant in that case, like you said, if you get acquitted or you win on appeal or something like that, you can be like the specific case where things were negative about you or where false information perhaps or really personal information was exposed or came out in front of the court, that could be detrimental to you for the rest of your life. That could follow you because the internet is forever. Yeah.
And I mean, there's a law in Austria against recording in court sessions, but still, like, how do you guarantee this if it's a Zoom court? Like, at least in a physical court, if someone stands there with their cell phone out, you can see this, but on Zoom you won't notice.
Yeah. So I mean, on the one hand, we are still giving effect to the right to a public hearing in the context of virtual proceedings, but there's all these extra negatives that might come into play. Okay, so the next important element in the right to a fair trial is that the hearing should be done in front of an impartial an independent decision maker or decision-making body, right?
Yeah, which doesn't really change
No.
in Zoom courts.
So, I mean, we don't have a jury system, so I'm not really sure how it works when you have a jury. If you can have a jury on Zoom court, that's a question mark.
Yeah.
But if it's just a judge, then, I mean, of course, the judge shows up and everything is as normal.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, one point maybe to the right to a fair trial, because, like, we do have some advantages there, and I quickly want to talk about this. So, for example, cost factor.
Oh, true. Yes.
So it's much easier if you don't have to travel to court, and your lawyer doesn't have to travel to court, sometimes over far distances.
Yeah.
That this definitely makes it easier for you to even bring claims. So it's not even just criminal court, but it's also civil proceedings.
Yeah.
Which is, can make it easier. Also, you don't really have that much of a barrier to do this, really, because it's so much easier to sit in your living room and, for example, testify or argue a case, as opposed to being in court and actually showing up there and going there.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a convenience factor, but there also might come into the cons is, what if people don't have access to internet or good internet? Do we now expect people to go to Starbucks or to go to internet cafes and sit down and have their legal proceedings happen in that sort of a context? Because that's problematic.
Right. And even if you have a good internet, normally you have a good internet connection, can always drop. It might not even be your fault.
Exactly.
And what happens then? Everybody knows the stress when Zoom fails, and even if it's just a work meeting.
Yes.
So
now if your life is hanging on the balance, it's a bit much.
Yeah. So I read an article even about prisons in Uganda not having good enough internet to support Zoom calls, which led to, it really affected these court sessions negatively, because you couldn't really get into the call, and then it would drop out and everything. So it was really a hassle about this.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that goes to fairness is perhaps the credibility of witnesses that appear in these Zoom court cases, right? Because, like we said, no one knows who's behind the camera or who's in the same room as you. So is witness credibility affected by Zoom courts negatively? Because I read some articles where judges were saying that no, actually they feel like they connect better with the witness, because now they can look the witness in the face on the camera and things like that. And then opposing views where judges were saying no, they don't know who else is in the room with the witness or who might be coaching the witness behind the scenes. So that's also problematic.
I can see both arguments there, especially considering that probably people are wearing masks in court right now if they appear physically. So, which also makes it harder to really judge the credibility of a witness, for example.
Yeah, so definitely the question of fairness is it could be fair. Fairness might be affected in that, so that's one of those things where it really will depend on the case, and if all the parties in the case have access to good internet, if witnesses are trustworthy, and all of these things will come into play and could be compromised on Zoom court. Okay, so another important element of the right to a fair trial is that cases should be held in a reasonable time frame. And I think this is something that we have to say is a definite big pro about doing these virtual hearings, is that courts can see different cases quickly, and you don't have to wait forever to book a courtroom and find a date and be on the docket and all of those different types of logistical elements.
Right. I read an article on how this works in Canada, where sometimes prisoners are transported from the prison to the court for hours sometimes, and have to wake up at 5 a.m. to then appear in court at 10, which just for a 10-minute hearing, if even that. So this really, the logistics in all of this is quite extreme, and isn't really on the same level as the importance of the trial sometimes.
Yeah, so I think definitely that is a huge thing. And also with cases that are quite easy cases, it kind of feels like the time frame issue becomes even more relevant, because if it's quite a quick case that the court can, listen to the argument and make a decision, then why does it need to sit on the docket and wait for 3 months or 4 months when those cases could be resolved a lot quicker?
And also, the hearings themselves might be easier, might be quicker. I saw one argument that evidence can be presented easier, at least digital evidence.
Yeah.
So this makes it easier, more simple, simply.
Exactly. Okay, so the final element on the right to a fair trial that we're going to discuss is the element of having representation. And like Paul said earlier, perhaps having virtual hearings makes it easier and cheaper to have representation, because lawyers can handle more cases in a day. They don't have to travel from one court to the next court and things like that. And also travel costs are eliminated, which would typically be something that would be charged to the client. So now the client can, save on those costs, and perhaps it gives you access to better legal representation.
Right, because you can choose a lawyer that doesn't live in your city or the city where the trial is held.
Exactly. So that's definitely a major pro. So, and another thing that doesn't really fit into the things that we're talking about, but it's kind of something that I read on the side, was that a study found that there's been increased safety in domestic violence cases. And a lot of victims in domestic violence cases feel that having their trials on Zoom has made it easier for them to face the defendant, made it easier for them to testify without feeling, pressured or feeling scared. So like all these different elements are also important.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the same argument as you mentioned in the beginning, right, with the children testifying over video conference even before COVID. And this also extends to victims of crime, especially if it's sensitive ones.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just discuss other pros and cons, perhaps, that you might think could be problematic or positive.
So I read a lot about lawyers and especially judges complaining about the ceremony of the trial, so that it's so unceremonious.
I think, you know what? I think the legal fraternity, we love the ceremonies, especially if you come from like a legal order that's quite ancient. Like if you still practice like English law or Roman Dutch law, like in South Africa, then there's quite a whole ceremony with court cases, right? The judge coming in, the black robes, everybody standing up, the advocate going to the front, like it's a whole song and dance.
Yeah.
And
I think the lighting the candles in Austria during the oath, and it's like symbols, so many symbols.
Symbolic. And I think people love that. And I think for a lot of judges, don't hate me, there's an ego thing attached to,
definitely,
being able to stand up there and everybody stands up when you walk in. I understand it, but I don't think it contributes to a fair trial. I don't think it's necessary for justice to be administered for all of these ceremonies to be in place.
Especially because so many trials aren't even that emotional or are that like official or ceremonious. So it might just be, two companies in a trademark dispute. Like there's no conflict resolution needed. It's just like, what does the law say and how is the case decided?
Exactly. Or like a traffic violation. Right. You know what I mean? There's no reason that you have to have all of this song and dance over traffic violations or things like that.
And I mean, the ceremony can even be intimidating. Exactly. So if you have to appear in front of court and this is going to be this whole thing. Like it's more, on Zoom at least, it's more like dealing with a normal government entity and like just going to another office.
It definitely reduces the anxiety. Right. And that could mean that people would actually bring cases. People would actually report domestic violence issues or, actually sue people or do, really enforce their rights if they didn't feel the stress and the pressure of going to the courthouse and dealing with all the blah, blah, blah that comes along with that.
Right.
Another thing that's important is kind of the confidentiality and security from a technical perspective. And I think this is an important point that a lot of judges and lawyers who argue against these virtual hearings really kind of harp on. And they are really worried about, personal information, court information being leaked and going into the hands of wrong people. I mean, in April of last year, Zoom had a huge data breach, which resulted in passwords and people's accounts being posted on the dark web and stuff like that. So I think from a data protection, confidentiality, security, privacy aspect, that's something that we need to consider.
Definitely. So if, for example, an anonymous witness whose identity is supposed to be protected and its data is leaked, that could be an issue. And in general, and especially because most of these trials are held via Zoom, and this is why we've called it Zoom court for now. I think Austria uses Webex, but it's still like private companies producing the software and not the government being in control of this.
Yeah, so that's also a question that we need to think about when we think about where are we going, So final question to you is, where do we go from here? So when, things are better pandemic-wise, or we have more widespread vaccines and things like that, and we go back to being able to go into a courtroom, Do we go back to what we were doing? Do we stick with Zoom courts? Like, what do you think? What would you do?
I feel like most of it is going back now. So like that's just the tradition. That's what everybody is used to. And so it's like the movement towards like normality, as in so many areas. So this is more or less the one extreme. Just go back to normal and everything will stay the same.
Which I don't agree with. I don't like that extreme as an option. I mean, I know we've weighed the pros and the cons, but I do think that Zoom is proposing a hybrid system. And I feel like we're hybriding with everything, like even work from home. Now we're in a hybrid work from home system. But Zoom is promoting a hybrid system, which I kind of like. In the one sense, they're saying, let's keep Zoom hearings for trivial, quote unquote, cases, for simple traffic violations, cases that don't necessarily need to be in front of a court urgently or need to be in front of a court because of matter of sensitivity and things like that. Let's do those cases on Zoom. They're also saying let's do divorce proceedings, which could get really heated and things like that. Let's do those cases on Zoom where we can de-escalate the situation. And then more sensitive murder, high intense criminal cases or cases that, you know, result in a massive outcome and really affect people's liberties and freedoms and things like that, we do those cases in person.
Yeah, I mean, the other end of the extreme, so the other extreme is doing it all online and having virtual proceedings, sometimes even without Zoom, but just doing it written and maybe not even having a judge. So one example how this could work is when you look at eBay, they have this kind of dispute resolution mechanism. So between buyers and sellers on eBay, if either the price doesn't get paid or the seller doesn't deliver the good, then this goes to this kind of mechanism for dispute resolution. And it's really simple because there's no human involved. So essentially, the one side brings its claim, the other side responds to it. Then they can either settle the case or eBay decides, which is automatic in most ways. And this really has a lot of cases. So there were 60 million dispute settlement cases until 2010.
Whoa!
So from like the
must have tripled by now.
Right. So this is the latest data that I found. But it's low value cases, so it's averaging between $70 and $100.
Okay.
So it's simple cases because it's like one legal question essentially, really low value, and the number goes up easily. And they also have this kind of system with strikes. So if a user, for example, doesn't pay the price, then they get a strike and they can appeal this. But the first appeal is granted automatically, and only the second appeal is really looked at by a human. I
mean, that would be the other extreme. Right. So automating justice completely in specific cases. I wouldn't be opposed to that for, little trivial cases like for traffic violations and things like that. I feel like perhaps if we had some sort of government or judicial platform where you could go in, put your case number in, and then you know what I mean? And that whole process was automated. That could potentially work, but obviously we're not suggesting that, there should be some artificial intelligence telling you whether you go to jail for 10 years or not.
Especially because we listed all of these rights to a fair trial, and this doesn't fulfill many of them.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's up to you guys. You guys can let us know what you think. Do you think we should go back to what we were doing back in the day, pre-COVID? Should we have this hybrid system that Zoom and a lot of these other platforms are pushing, but purely for commercial purposes for them, but could be good for us? Right. Or are you on the side of eBay going full extreme and automating dispute resolution?
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear what you think. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Aequi podcast. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another interesting topic. I hope you stay tuned. Bye.
Bye.